Hi, welcome back. In this session I will focus on the last theory which we will focus on in this course. This means that we have gone through bureaucracy, decision making and culture. The study of institutions in organization theory became popular in the 1970s in relation to the publication of a number of seminal articles by researchers at Stanford and Yale University. Together their research came to be the starting point for one of the largest and perhaps most diverse theory on organizations. The researchers at Stanford and Yale did not invent the study of institutions. The term institution is itself as old as Weber's writing about bureaucracy and usually referred to as the study object of sociology. It was not even the first time that the idea of institutions was applied to organizations. Roughly 30 years before institutional theory became popular, Philip Selznick, who was inspired by Weber's bureaucracy, used the concept of an institution to think about how bureaucrats became attached to the rule itself and created meaning and identity around these rules. As he called it, rules became infused with values. You can read more about Selznick and his study in the course book. It's a famous study and had been very influential. The new institutional theory, in contrast to Selznick's old institutional theory, was heavily inspired by a book written by Peter Berger and Thomas Lackman. The book was published in 1966 and was called The Social Construction of the Reality. The book became extremely popular and spread all around the world and is used in almost all sociological classes at the bachelor level today. The main idea of the book is that interacting people create mental representations or scripts of each other's actions. Over time, these mental representations might become habituated and spread in a society and over generations, creating something called an institution. It is a quite interesting book to read and I strongly recommend it. Anyhow, what made the new institutional theory so radical for organizational theorists was the way in which it questioned the rationality of organizational structure. Think back to Weber's model about bureaucracy. Here we largely assume that the goals and the rules that were invented in the bureaucracy was invented because they had a certain function, right? The goals and the rules were assumed to be rational and contributing to productivity and efficiency of the organization. Rules helped the organization to produce things more efficiently. Weber's assumption about the rationality of structures was also the assumption taken by some of the researchers from Stanford University. For instance, Richard Scott, which you've heard from before. So that in the 1960s and 1970s, they started a research program to study the structure of educational programs across high schools in California. The schools they studied were quite different and operated under quite different circumstances or environments. So basically they started out the program assuming that formal structure was rational and expected to see quite a lot of differences across the schools in terms of how they define the goals and how they define specific rules. However, when they started to analyze the data, they realized that most schools looked very similar, despite being located in different environments and subjected for very different circumstances. Looking closer on their findings, they realized that perhaps all this similarity across schools was generated because schools shared the same mental model of what a real school should look like. Perhaps schools only implemented goals and rules that was perceived by the government, by parents and by students as appropriate for schools to have. If this was true, formal structures such as goals and rules would not be invented only because they are rational, like Weber said, but also because they give legitimacy to organizations. If a school have the same goals and rules as all other schools, the environment, basically the government, parents and students will think that what a school do is in line with what the school is supposed to do. The school is a legitimate form of organization. This was the birth of the thought that goals and rules in organizations, the formal structure of organizations, might be used not because they are efficient or rational, but because they give legitimacy to organizations. If an organization implements a certain goal or rule, people outside the organization will behave as if the organization acts as they should act. It's important to recognize that this was only the starting point and that the institutional theory have grown to include a wide range of different sub-theories. For instance, during the last 20 years, researchers have debated something called institutional logics. I think it can be useful to talk about what an institution is. One of the most promising definitions of an institution is provided by Ronald Jefferson in a book chapter from 1991. In the book chapter, he emphasizes that an institution represents a social order or a pattern that has obtained a certain state or property. An institution represents a social pattern that is reproduced unless collective action blocks or disrupts the reproduction process. Institutionalization denotes the process of how a social pattern becomes relatively self-reproducing. Let's think about some common empirical examples. Think about the handshake. For decades we have shaken hands before meetings or when we are introduced to a new person. It's thought of as an act, greeting people, and have been one of the most common examples of an institution. Imagine what happens when you meet a new person and you don't want to shake their hands. What do you need to do? Probably you need to explain to them that you don't want to shake their hands for some reason. And the person probably wants to hear a good reason for why you don't want to shake his or her hand. I remember one situation in the coffee room, and I still remember how offended I felt when my colleague didn't want to shake my hand. Shaking hands are used as a symbol for greetings all across the world, and it has been used for many generations. It's easy to shake hands. It requires effort to not shake hands. This is a typical example of a social self-reproduced act. It represents an institution. It might help to understand what an institution is by thinking about what it is not. Let's focus on the difference between institutions and decisions. Both institutions and decisions represent, in some sense, two types of social orders. We create order in society by taking decisions or following institutions. Decisions create order by choosing one alternative in front of another alternative. In fact, a decision requires that there exists an alternative that is possible to choose from. However, in a highly institutional social pattern, you don't take decisions. You just follow what everyone else is doing. If you take a decision, you intervene in the pattern, just like you do if you don't want to shake the hand of a person that you're meeting for the first time. If shaking hands is an institutional pattern, we only take action by refusing to offer our hand. This is also why an order based on decisions is often perceived as a weaker form of social order than order based on institutions. We can advance our thinking about a social reproduced pattern by imagining a particular type of social pattern is linked to other social patterns, and that one social pattern helps reproducing or breaking the degree of institutionalization of another social pattern. Let's take an example. Think about a computer's basic operating system and a word processing program. For a software engineer, the basic operating system would be more of an institution relative to the word processing program. Another example is capitalism. Capitalism, which could be seen as one social pattern, appears as an institution relative to the transactions that are carried out in a grocery store, which is another social pattern. Goals of an organization might appear as more of an institution than specific rules for how bureaucrats should classify their client's situation, since the goals justify the existence of the rules. This means that institutions and decisions might be related to each other. Let's say that a department have a goal to give people in a particular region access to healthcare, and that there exist a number of rules for how to fulfill these goals. In the everyday work, the bureaucrat working in a department might continually take decisions regarding a client's situation. who should get healthcare and who shouldn't get healthcare. Although the bureaucrats do take decisions, they have a rule and they are confronted with alternatives and they choose the best alternative, right? They still might reproduce the deeper institution that exists at the level of goals or rules of the department, right? What is a decision for a bureaucrat might represent a reproduction of the institution that says that a department or an organization should have goals and rules. In this sense, what the bureaucrat needs to do to break the institution is to stop taking decisions. This really links into the session about rule-based decision making. Often people in organizations follow rules and thereby also reproduce institutionalized social patterns. We can strengthen an institution that says that organizations should have goals by carrying out the specific rules designed to fulfill the goals. Even if institutions are the products of people, it does not mean that people need to be aware of institutions. Indeed, institutions are useful exactly because they offer us order in a society without forcing us to think and decide about our actions. Many of the social patterns we interpret as institutions are actually taken for granted. Again, the handshake is one example. Most of the time we only just do them. An interesting question is what is required to break an institution. We are currently in the middle of a pandemic, and one of the consequences of the pandemic is actually that the handshake has been more or less abandoned, right? It's very interesting to see whether or not the handshake will resume when the pandemic is over, or if we will forget about it. In the next session, I will focus on leadership in organizations. As I mentioned in the introduction lecture, leadership is normally not part of organizational theory as a discipline. This means that you now have all the pieces you need for your first toolbox for organizational analysis: bureaucracy, decision making, culture, and institutions. In the course paper, you will relate your organizational toolbox with a few insights taken from leadership.